Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the genetics and physiology of personality. This topic is particularly important. Let's look back at trait theories and remember there are two different conceptions of traits. We have traits as being the true cause of behavior, all right, traits as internal and actually causing behavior. And we have traits as purely descriptive terms to describe someone's uh, behavior. So looking at one's genetics and physiology and seeing if there are some relations between one's genetics and one's physiology and personality helps us kind of figure out which of these conceptions of traits is true, or which of these conceptions of traits is accurate. So if traits truly cause behavior, we should see that these traits correlate with particular brain regions, for instance. So maybe it's the case that someone that's more extroverted has more brain activity in their frontal lobes. If this is correct, if this is true, well then maybe it's the case that the trait is truly internal and it resides somewhere in the brain. And when we refer to someone being highly extroverted, we're in fact referring to someone as having maybe more brain activity in a particular brain region. Or maybe it's the case that agreeableness is related to how large your amygdala is, or your amygdala are, because there's two of them. So if we find that that is the case, we're actually referring to physiological differences when we aren't using terms like, oh, that person's more extroverted, or that person's not very agreeable. If it were the case that traits are just ways to describe behavior, we shouldn't see that these traits are correlated with physiological things, so brain regions, particular genes, things like that. So this discussion is going to be pretty important. In this video, we're going to specifically focus on the genetics of personality. In another video, we're going to look at the physiology of personality. All right, so first, let's look at the genetics of personality. Now, there's two major questions in behavioral genetics. And behavioral genetics is kind of the intersection between psychology and genetics. Anytime we're looking at the genetics of things like mental disorders, genetics of cognitive abilities, genetics of personality traits, anything like this, we're referring to, or we're in the discipline of behavioral genetics. Two major questions. First is the question of heritability. How much of a person's personality is due to their genetics? This is the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Now, at this point in time, if you've had human growth and development, this question, it might not be too interesting for you, because you know that the answer to this question is almost always both, right? Both nature and both nurture contribute to variation in someone's personality, in their behavior, in their intelligence, whatever it is, both nature and nurture play a role. But we can take this a step further in behavioral genetics and ask how much of the variation is due to nature and nurture. All right, how important is nature versus nurture? Maybe it's the case that this is primarily due to nature. Maybe it's the case that this is primarily due to nurture. We can answer these questions in behavioral genetics. Again, this is the question of heritability. Heritability is the proportion, the percentage of variation in a trait that can be attributable to someone's genetics. All right, that question, not nearly as interesting as this next question. Which specific genes are related to which personality traits? All right, which specific genes are related to which personality traits? Maybe it's the case if we find a gene for a neurotransmitter receptor, maybe a dopamine receptor, is correlated with extroversion. Well, that's pretty important. We might know that dopamine is in the dopamine system in the brain is related to how extroverted a person is. So if we can find correlates between personality and specific genes, this will tell us a lot about the biological pathway of a particular personality trait, and we might be able to see why people vary in this particular trait and how these personality traits end up coming to fruition from when someone's a baby to when they're an adult. So there's plenty of really important work and findings if we can find relationships between specific genes and particular personality traits. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this lecture, let's talk a little bit about some basic genetics, some things that you probably have heard time and time again throughout biology classes, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. All right. In every single cell in the human body, within the nucleus of that cell, there are 46 chromosomes. All right. 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes. Homologous means similar, okay, because homo means same. All right, so we have pairs of chromosomes that pretty much contain the exact same genes, but there might be some small variations between those genes. All right, and chromosome, let's talk about what chromosome means. Chromosome literally means colored body in Greek. When biologists back in the day would stain cells, they would find occasionally in the nucleus of these cells that there would be these particular bodies that would take up their stain really well. And so they called these chromosomes. They didn't know exactly what they were or why they were important and why it was the case that they only were able to see them at certain points in time. But it turns out that chromosomes are very, very important. So we get 23 of our chromosomes. So 1/2 of all those pairs from your father's sperm and 23 pairs from your mother. So your dad gives you one version of the gene, your mom gives you maybe the same version of the gene, maybe a slightly different version of the gene. All right? For the most part, there are some exceptions. So you receive half of your genetic material from your father and half of your genetic material from your mother. We can look at what's contained within these chromosomes, and the most important part for us is this chemical known as DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And within this DNA, we have the blueprints of life, as it's sometimes referred to in biology textbooks. DNA, the interesting part of it is it's made up of 4 different nucleotides, and based off of the sequence of those 4 different nucleotides, this is going to code for all of the proteins in your body and all of your cells. All right. So each chromosome, there's a super long string of DNA. We can look at specific parts of that DNA that code for a single protein, and we can call these genes. So gene, that term has a lot of different definitions, and if you were in genetics, you would have a much more complicated definition than what I'm going to have. But at least for this class, think of the gene as the basic unit of heredity. One gene is going to code for one protein, at least in this class. All right, and by protein, I don't mean yum, chicken, beef, so things that you talk about with your diet. That's not what we're referring to. Proteins are the movers and shakers of the biochemical world. So a lot of the important aspects, important things that cells do are due to the proteins that are specifically in that cell. So for instance, if we look at neurotransmitters and the receptors for neurotransmitters, those neurotransmitters for receptors are proteins. If we look at your blood, hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen throughout your body. That's found in red blood cells. That's pretty important. How cells move, they move via 2 proteins called actin and myosin. All right, actin and myosin are proteins. So a lot of the important functions of these cells are carried out by proteins. And each gene codes for one, sometimes multiple different proteins. All right. What is this process? Well, this process is referred to as the central dogma of genetics. So let's refer to what this central dogma is. This is how most proteins are made. Things get a little bit more complicated if you get further on in genetics, but we won't talk about that. So this DNA resides in the nucleus of the cell. Okay, there's one master copy, right? Think about it. If there were, one major blueprint of how to make a house or how to make some shop thing. So, like how all Wendy's look the same. Let's say we're trying to build a new Wendy's. Okay, I'm thinking of Wendy's because I had Wendy's for lunch. Sorry, guys. All right, so there's one major blueprint of Wendy's that is stored inside the cell. Well, you want to use this blueprint to make yourself a new Wendy's, but if you took that blueprint out, there wouldn't be a blueprint anymore, and you might spill coffee on it or whatever. Okay, so we need to make a copy of that DNA. We need to make a copy of that code. So this process is called transcription, if I can spell. All right. So with transcription, an enzyme comes in and makes a copy of the DNA. All right. And this copy is not the exact same thing as DNA. It's via a strand of RNA. Okay. Particularly messenger RNA. So it's like we make a photocopy of those blueprints to make a Wendy's. Okay, to use our Wendy's example. All right, so we've got this messenger RNA that we can take outside the vault, right? It doesn't matter if we get this copy messed up. We still got that version in our bank, in our nucleus of our cell. So we've got this copy, this Xerox. All right, so the messenger RNA leaves the nucleus of the cell and goes and finds a ribosome. All right, and it finds that ribosome, and that ribosome looks at the messenger copy of the RNA and then constructs a protein based off of what the code is. This process is called translation. This would be like, in our Wendy's example, having that copy of the blueprint and you give it to a builder. You give it to someone in construction. And they're going to convert that blueprint to an actual Wendy's building that's going to look similar to all other Wendy's buildings. This is the process of translation. All right. And the majority of proteins are built this way. All right. How many genes are there in the human genome? Genome here is the sum total of all of our genetic material. So current estimates are that humans have between 20 to 25,000 genes. You can't just look at the sum total of proteins there are in the human body, because some genes actually code for multiple proteins. So the estimate always fluctuates the more and more we find out about the human genome. Okay. And this has changed dramatically throughout the years. In fact, when I was a college student, which wasn't that long ago, I promise you, probably about 10 years ago now, when I had genetics, when I was a sophomore. I took that no, I was a junior when I had genetics. You don't care about that. I care about that. I'm sorry, I'm reminiscing on the good old days. Okay. So when I was in genetics, my textbook said that there were 40,000 genes. And that was about 10 years ago. That's not that long ago. We're finding more and more about genetics every single day. This is a science that things are discovered rapidly and quickly. Things have changed in the past 3 years or so. You always have to keep up to date with what's going on. And even in the 90s, before the Human Genome Project, where we mapped out all of the genes in the human DNA, we thought there were about 100,000 genes. So this number has dramatically reduced in the past few years. Okay, sometimes people like to bring up the following quote. If we look at a chimpanzee, okay, we can see that 96 to 99% of the genetic material of chimpanzee is identical to that of humans, and this is correct. The fluctuation between 96 and 99 depends on how we calculate the similarity of our DNA. There's a few different ways of doing that. All right, and this is very interesting, right? It kind of shows you that just with a few small changes in your DNA lead to the vast differences in appearance and behavior between chimpanzees and human beings, right? Just a very small tweaks and changes here and there lead to the differences between me, this face that you see up here, and this lovely chimpanzee face that we see down here. All right, and this is true and sort of shows you how closely genetically we are related to our closest living cousins, chimpanzees. But another thing that I'd like to point out is that all living beings, everything living, has a lot of conserved DNA. All right, some of the proteins are the same in human beings as they are in bean sprout plants, right? So if we look at things like bananas, human beings have roughly 50% of the same DNA as bananas, and we are vastly different than bananas, right? So a lot of DNA for living organisms is highly conserved. It's similar. All right, so there's our basics of genetics. So how do we, let's ask our first question. How do we test if personality is attributable to nature or nurture? Think about your human growth and development class if you've had that. How do you answer this question? Well, there's two major kinds of studies that you might talk about in a class like that. Twin studies and adoption studies. And behavioral geneticists and psychologists have used these studies for decades. The easiest study to talk about is that of twin studies. Now, psychologists and behavioral geneticists are going to rely on a natural experiment, an experiment that nature has created haphazardly. All right, with twin studies, we're looking at the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins. Identical twins, sometimes referred to as monozygotic twins, these are twins that share approximately 100% of their same DNA. Okay, give me 1 second here. All right, identical twins share 100% of the same DNA. Essentially what happens is one sperm fertilizes one egg, and that zygote splits into two. Boop. And they develop to two separate embryos, two separate fetuses, two separate human beings. So these two separate human beings have 100% of the same DNA. We can contrast this with fraternal twins, sometimes referred to as dizygotic twins. Dizygotic twins, two separate sperm fertilize two separate eggs, and they develop to two separate human beings. Now, these twins, these fraternal twins, are just as similar to one another as traditional siblings are. The only difference is that they're born at the same time. So these two different sets of twins, identical and fraternal twins, are born at the same time. They have the same parents. One might say that they have a similar amount of similar nurture. Right? Their parents treat them similarly to one another. So any difference in the amount of similarity in personality traits between identical twins and fraternal twins can only be due to one thing. It can only be due to the fact that identical twins are more genetically similar to one another compared to fraternal twins. So we can rely on this logic to try and calculate the proportion of variation in someone's personality traits that is attributable to nature, attributable to genetics. Another term for this is the heritability of a particular personality trait. All right, this is just kind of showing you what I was talking about beforehand. We have monozygotic twins, we have dizygotic twins. Monozygotic twins share approximately 100% of their genes with one another, whereas dizygotic twins or fraternal twins share approximately 50% of their genes with one another. So we're going to look at how similar identical twins are with their personality traits. We can look at how similar fraternal twins are in their personality traits, and if there's a difference in similarity, well, then we know that that difference in similarity, whereas identical twins are more similar in their personality traits, has to be due to genes. So again, theoretically, these sets of twins are treated similar to one another, as similar to one another as each set of identical twins. All right. So heritability is the percentage or the proportion of variation of a specific trait that that is attributable to someone's genetics, right? We can look, so we're going to do a little bit of math here, all right? We're going to do a little bit of math to calculate the heritability of a particular trait using fraternal twins and identical twins, or monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. So there's three sources of variation that we're going to be interested in. There is heritability, the proportion of variance attributable to genetics. All right, we're going to call this A. Okay, A is going to be heritability, or the proportion of variance attributable to one's genetics. We have C. This is the shared environment, the environment common to the family. Right, you and your siblings probably have similar personality traits because you're raised by the same family. Right, your father might be as strict with you as they are with their brother, as your brother or sister. You lived in the same household. Your parents taught you the same things growing up. You lived in the same community. So this is environmental effects to your personality that are common to siblings. Right, the fact that you were raised in the same household, that you had the same parents. So this is C, and we're going to call this C with our equations. And then we have non-shared environment, or environment not common to the family, right? Maybe it's the case that you did ballet lessons and your brother did football. Okay, your sister played piano and you did tap dancing. Okay, are different among siblings. This is different among twins. Environmental effects to your personality that are not due to the family that you're raised in. Okay, so this is the environment not common to the family, the non-shared environment here. So with our heritability estimates, we're going to try to break down 100% of the variation, 100%, into these three different sources of variation: genetics, shared environment, non-shared environment. And we can use a little bit of logic and math to come up with the answer to this equation. So the kind of study that we're going to do is we're going to do a correlational study. We're going to look at the Pearson correlation coefficient that we know and that we love. I don't know about love, but same old Pearson correlation coefficient. We're going to get a crap ton of identical twins and a crap ton of fraternal twins. This is going to be hard research to do. You're going to need a lot of resources to do it, right? So this kind of research is only conducted in certain universities that have a long list of twins that are able to pay these twins to come back and do their studies again and again and again. And we're going to look at identical twins, and we're going to put one of the twins and say they're twin 1, and one of the twins randomly are going to be twin 2. We're going to calculate a correlation coefficient between their personality traits, how much intelligence they have, whatever individual difference we're looking at. We're going to do the same thing with fraternal twins. Okay, fraternal twin U, we're going to be randomly assigned to twin 1, randomly assigned to twin 2, and we calculate that correlation coefficient. So we're going to have two data points, boom, a monozygotic twin correlation and a dizygotic twin correlation. Now, if genetics is important, the monozygotic twin correlation should be greater than the dizygotic twin correlation. If they're the same, heritability is 0. All right. So if we look at the monozygotic twin correlation, the reason why monozygotic twins are similar to one another in personality is because of two reasons: that they have the same genetics, they have 100% of the same DNA, and they are raised in the same family as one another. Their shared environment is the same. So the monozygotic twin correlation is a function of A plus C. We're going to solve for A and C, but not yet. All right, so we have A and C. Then for our dizygotic twin correlation, is a function of having 50% of the same DNA as one another. That's the reason why they're similar to one another. And they have 100% of the same shared environment. So the dizygotic twin correlation is going to be a function of half of A plus C. Now, if we're interested in, we know what the monozygotic twin correlation is. We know what the dizygotic twin correlation is because we did our twin study. If we want to find A, we can do a little bit of algebra and solve for A here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this second equation and subtract it from the first equation. And the reason I'm doing this is because C is an unknown. And if I can have C minus C, it's going to cancel out and be 0. Anything minus itself is 0. So I'm going to have the monozygotic twin correlation minus the dizygotic twin correlation. A minus half of an A, which is half an A. C minus C is 0. So I have the monozygotic twin correlation minus the dizygotic twin correlation equals to half of A. All right. Now, if again, if we're solving for A, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. So instead of having half an A over here, I'm going to have A is equal to 2 times the difference between the monozygotic twin correlation and the dizygotic twin correlation. Boom. Now, you could know the logic that I'm going through here, and I find that that is the easiest thing to do for me. But if you just want to memorize one equation, this is the equation to do. You can go from any kind of twin study and calculate the heritability easily using this metric. There are many different ways of calculating heritability. I'm doing the easiest one. This one only uses algebra. It doesn't use model fit and all that kind of fun stuff. So that's how we're going to calculate the heritability with some of the early twin studies. All right, so let's do an example of this. And not only that, let's calculate C and E as well. That seems kind of important. So we do our twin study, and let's say that we're looking at extroversion. We find that with our tons of monozygotic twins, the correlation between extroversion scores of twin 1 and twin 2 is 0.6. Sorry, fairly sizable correlation. But for dizygotic twins, the correlation is about 0.32. Let's go calculate the heritability. Remember, heritability in this case is A. So this is 2 times the difference between these two. So I'm going to take 0.60 minus 0.32, and I'm going to multiply that difference by 2. So 0.60 minus 0.32 is going to give me 0.28. Multiply that by 2. The heritability is going to be equal to 0.56. So 56% of the variance is due to one's genetics. It's due to nature and not nurture. Cool. That's the kind of reaction I want you to get. Okay? We can calculate heritability very easily by calculating these correlation coefficients. Now let's look at the proportion of variance associated with the family environment, the shared environment. This is C. Let's go back to one of our original equations, that the correlation of the monozygotic twins is a function, is the sum of A plus C. Well, guess what? We know what the monozygotic twin correlation is. We know what heritability is right now, so we can solve for C. All right, so I'm going to subtract both sides by 0.56, and I'm going to get that C is equal to 0.04. This means that 4% of the variation in one's personality is due to the shared environment. Notice that that's a very small number, and we find out that's typically the case for personality traits where your shared environment contributes very little to one's personality. How do we find E? Well, A and C have to add up. A, C, and E is the non-shared environment, all have to add up to 1. Okay, so if I have 0.56, I have 0.04, I find that the non-shared environment has to be 0.40. Another thing that I can do is I can take 1 minus the monozygotic twin correlation, because the monozygotic twin correlation is A plus C. So 1 minus this has to give us E. So I find that E is 0.40. All right, so I was able to figure out the heritability, shared environment, non-shared environment, using some basic math. So that's twin studies. All right. Another thing that we can do is adoption studies, and we can do similar math there, but I'm not going to do it. With adoption studies, we look at the adopted child's personality, their intelligence, whatever individual difference we're looking at, and we see how similar it is to their biological parents and their adoptive parents. All right. If they are more similar to their biological parents in terms of personality, we know that nature has the very important function, important role to play. If they're more similar to their adoptive parents, the amount of similarity there tells us the shared environment, the proportion of variance that's due to the shared environment, the environment that they're raised up with, how their parents treated them. All right. So we can do adoptive studies as well, and we can do some kind of crazy studies sometimes too. Crazy is probably the wrong word here. We can do a mix mash of some of these studies. We can look at adopted twins, where one twin goes to this part of the country and this other twin goes to another part of the country. It's harder to do that because it happens not super frequently that twins are split up like that, but some studies have looked at that. All right. Before we move on and look at the results of twin and adoption studies for personality, let me mention that there are some problems with these twin and adoption studies. There are some problems in calculating heritability this way. Now, I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 different reasons why these studies are problematic. The first one is going to be the most difficult. I'm going to say it and then I'm going to explain it for you. So, one problem with twin studies is that they describe the heritability of the trait that is currently there for our population, not what it potentially could be. What the heck do I mean here? So let me give you an example here. Let's talk about 2 different fictitious societies. In one society, it is completely egalitarian. You were born, your parents are pretty much treat you exactly the same. Every family has the exact same amount of money. You have the same amount of education. The society is completely egalitarian. Everybody's upbringing is very similar. All right. If we were to conduct a twin study in that environment, we would find that heritability accounts for the vast majority of variation in personality. Why? Because the environment is very similar for everybody. So the proportion of variance attributable to the environment is small because everybody's environment, their upbringing is very similar. So heritability is going to contribute for more of the variation there. We're going to think that genetics plays a very important role if we're in a society like that. Now, let's say that we're in a different society. In this society, at birth, we flip a coin. And if it's heads, you end up in a part of society where you have unlimited food and unlimited education, and everything is hunky-dory, and you are living a good life. But if it lands on tails, you live in abject poverty. The family that you grow up with is very abusive towards you, and lots of bad things happen to you. In this case, the environment that you're in is going to make an important contribution to your personality because those environments are so different from one another. In the environmental relationship here, there's just more variability there. So obviously the environment is going to play more of a role. It's going to account for more variation in someone's personality there. All right, so if it's the case that everybody has the similar upbringing to one another, heredity is going to play a larger role. If it's the case that the environments are very different, just based on the society that we live in, heritability is going to be smaller. So twin studies show the heritability of the way that the population currently is, not necessarily what it could be. All right, and the more egalitarian a society is, the larger heritability estimates are going to be. All right, so that's one problem. Another problem is that they are going to ignore gene by environment interactions. Perhaps it's the case that for you to have a particular outcome, the environment has to be a particular way, and you have to have a particular gene. Okay, we'll look at an example of this in a slide or two. But one example here is the diathesis stress model of schizophrenia. In one model of schizophrenia, you need to have a genetic disposition and you need to have some traumatic event in your life. If you have both of those, you develop schizophrenia. If you just have the genetic disposition, you don't develop schizophrenia. If you just have the trauma, you don't develop schizophrenia. You have to have both, all right? Twin studies don't take this kind of interaction into consideration. Another thing is that they ignore gene by environment correlation. So let me give you an example of this. Suppose, if you would, that there's a gene that codes for seeking out new experiences. And you seek out new experiences, and you end up making, you go to like libraries, and you go out to public events, and you end up making more friends. You end up reading a lot of books. And it's the books and the friends that lead to differences in personality later on in life. Now, is the difference in how extroverted you are, how open you are to new experiences, is it due to nature or is it due to nurture? Well, the gene got you into the library. The gene got you into the friend group, but the interaction with the friends and the interaction with the books is what changed your personality. This is gene by environment correlation. With our current estimates of heritability, this variation goes into genetics and does not go into environment, even though in that situation it's really the environment that changes personality. So twin studies do not account for gene by environment correlation. They also assume that twin and adoptive children are representative of the entire population at large, and this is not necessarily the case. All right, twin and adoptive children, studies with them cannot necessarily generalize to the population at large. For the most part, this is true. For the most part, it's true that we can generalize to the population at large, but there are some differences with twins and adopted children that might limit our generalizability. Another problem that I don't have on here is that we are assuming that identical twins and dizygotic twins, fraternal twins, are treated as similar to one another by their parents in both those situations. That parents treat identical twins as similarly as parents of fraternal twins treat their fraternal twins, okay? We know that this is not true. Parents treat identical twins more similarly in their upbringing than they do dizygotic or fraternal twins. So this kind of is going to interrupt how we interpret twin studies as well. Let me give you an example of this. All right, so let me give you an example of this. So when I was in kindergarten, there was a set of twins, Brian and Kevin. And Brian and Kevin always wore the same clothes. Or not, their parents bought two sets of clothes and they wore it, and so they always looked the exact same. You don't do this for fraternal twins. Okay, so parents are going to treat identical twins more similarly than they do fraternal twins. Fun story here. For both the kindergarten teachers and all the kindergartners, it was very hard to tell Brian and Kevin apart. So what they decided to do, ingenious by my kindergarten teachers, they gave Brian a sticker and Kevin did not receive a sticker. So we were able to tell who's Brian and who was Kevin. Now, can you see a problem with that situation? Well, the problem was that Kevin did not get a sticker. And how dare the kindergarten teachers always give Brian the sticker and never give Kevin a sticker. So they ended up developing a system in which some days Brian would get the sticker and some days Kevin would get the sticker to be able to tell them apart. Fun kind of story there. So identical twins are treated more similarly to one another, and that's going to mess up the calculation of heritability with these twin studies. All right. So let me give you an example of gene by environment interaction. So this is a study that was which is sometimes called the Caspi study. It is a study by Robert Caspi, a personality and aging researcher in New Zealand. And what Caspi was able to do was convince the New Zealand government to help him conduct a research study. And what he did is he looked at newborn children in New Zealand, and he followed them from birth to adulthood, and he would look at a wide variety of different things. One thing that he looked at was their genetics, so he looked at particular genes. He also looked at whether or not the children were likely suffered from some kind of abuse, and then used both genetics and potential maltreatment of the children to predict whether or not these children would grow up to be someone that would commit a violent crime. All right, so researchers in this CASP study measured the amount of abuse that these children experienced, or that they were kind of able to infer. They also looked at different variations of a gene that codes for monoamine oxidase. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that breaks down some neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, so neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. So one version of monoamine oxidase does a very good job of breaking these down in the synaptic cleft. One version of monoamine oxidase does not do a good job of breaking it down in the synaptic cleft, so there's more neurotransmitters for one version. The specifics of the gene are not important. What's important is the interaction between the abuse and the version of the gene that you have. So there's two different versions of this gene. Okay, there's high MAO activity. This is where the version of monoamine oxidase does a good job of breaking down the neurotransmitters. And we have the low MAO version of this, where the MAO does not a very good job of breaking down the neurotransmitter. And we can look at children that experience no maltreatment. Maybe it's the case that they experience some maltreatment, probable maltreatment, or they experience severe maltreatment. All right, now let's look at the results of this study. Well, first of all, the more mistreated the child, the more likely they were to commit a violent crime. All right, that's unfortunate cycle of abuse, but it's there in the data. If we look at the version of the gene, all right, we see an interesting relationship. For the low MAO activity individuals, abuse has a huge effect. All right, if you're abused, you're very likely to be convicted of committing a violent crime if you were abused compared to if you were not abused. Whereas for people that have this version of MAO, abuse has less of an effect. Abuse has less of an effect as to who's likely to be convicted of committing a violent crime. All right, these bars are more similar to one another than these bars over here. All right, so there's an interaction between which gene you have and some aspect of the environment. Here, the amount of maltreatment a child experiences. All right, so let's go and look at the actual data with personality here. So here we're looking at a study by Lowland in 1992, and we can look at just the Pearson correlation coefficients here for extroversion and neuroticism. And we're looking at identical twins reared together versus fraternal twins reared together. And any differences in these correlations has to be due to genetics. Okay, identical versus fraternal. Reared together, reared apart. They're both reared together in this situation. So we can see here that there's a massive dip in what these correlations are, which shows us that heritability has a very important role. Let's do a different comparison. Identical twins reared together versus identical twins reared apart. We see that there is a smaller correlation here. Okay, if we go from reared together to reared apart, reared together to reared apart, but the dip is less big. Okay, it's a smaller effect in this particular situation. If we do the math, calculate A, C, and E, what we find is that genetics accounts for approximately 40% of the variation in personality traits, and that the non-shared environment, or E, the environment not common to siblings, accounts for approximately 60% of the variation in personality. All right, it depends on the study that we look at. Sometimes it's about 50-50, sometimes it's 40-60, but genetics plays a role and non-shared environment plays a role. All right, non-shared environment, maybe this twin had this group of friends, this twin had another group of friends, right? And those environments were different for them. Where is common environment? Where's shared environment? The environment attributable to the family that you're raised in, it's not there, all right? As it turns out, the shared environment does not seem to be that important for personality development. It also doesn't seem to be that important for your intelligence and your other cognitive abilities. Shared environment seems not to be nearly as important as non-shared environment. Now, shared environment is important for some things. So your political affiliation, right? Are you more liberal or more conservative? Your parents have a huge determination of where you are on that spectrum. What religion, your amount of spirituality, your parents have a huge impact on that, but not necessarily your personality and your intelligence. All right, here's another study. We have Ryman et al. In 1997. Yep, 1997. We see that for the big five personality traits, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience, across all of these, we see approximately 40% of the variation is due to genetics. About 60% of the variance is due to non-shared environment. Shared environment has a very small role to play here. Okay, that's important to know. So that's the question of heritability. Now let's ask the question about personality and specific genes. Okay, are there specific genes related to personality? This would be very cool if we find out specific genes that are related to personality, but it turns out we can't really do that. Okay, this is a problem that's unfortunately common in the study of behavioral genetics. It's known as the missing heritability problem. Now, clearly genes play a role. 40% of the variation in personality is due to genes. But we can't find one specific gene that correlates with personality. Or if it does correlate with personality, it correlates at a very, very small level. There's many reasons why we get this missing heritability problem. Right? Maybe it's the case that there's itty-bitty genes, or genes account for a small bit of variation, but there's just many of them. There's many, many different genes that account for a small bit of variation in someone's personality. And they all act additively with one another to determine what our personality is going to be. So that could be the case, right? And that is one typical interpretation of this, although there's some other people that have some other ideas of why we have the missing heritability problem. One gene that has been looked at a lot with the field of personality is DRD4. DRD4 is a receptor that codes for a dopamine receptor. It's a gene that codes for a dopamine receptor. There we go. And it's related to the amount of novelty seeking an organism ends up seeking out. So in one study here, we have ourselves a rat, and the rat is put in a cage with two different objects. One object is familiar. The rat is always presented with this object. And one object is new. It is a new object. Which one does the rat seek out and explore? The old object or the new object? The version of DRD4 is related to which of these objects the rat seeks out. With one version of DRD4, the rat seeks out the new object. In the other version, the rat seeks out the older object. We can look at this behavior with human beings as well, and it's actually correlated with how risky we do a gambling task. Okay, with a gambling task, maybe something like Deal or No Deal, we see that one version of DRD4 leads to a higher risk-taking behavior compared to the other version of DRD4. So there might be some genes in particular that are related to personality, but they have a relatively small effect looking at behavior. All right, so we'll end this video here, and in the next video, we'll talk about the physiology of personality. All right.